The women's suffrage movement was a Western phenomenon throughout the fin de siècle. Women staged parades, riots, and educational rallies in which they demanded suffrage and fought for the right to vote. Besides the great debate as to whether or not women should have the right to vote, there were also two different approaches the women's suffragists took in England. In one camp were the members of the Women's Social and Political Union, better known as the WSPU, a radical organization led by Emmeline Pankhurst and founded in 1903. This organization took on the nickname of the Suffragettes. The suffragettes were characterized by their use of radical methods such as hunger strikes, after which they were many times force-fed food, depicted here, where the woman is tied to a chair and forced to eat in a prison. It was also characterized by violence of many types, and in the case of Emily Davison at the Epsom Derby, suicide. Emily Davison was perhaps the most radical example of what women would do to fight for their suffrage. Emily Davison jumped in front of a horse at the Epsom Derby while protesting for women's rights. Davison is simply the most famous example of a member of the WSPU committing a radical act in order to garner attention for their cause. As the chief militant society of the women's suffrage movement, the WSPU was founded upon the principle that other tactics used to try to persuade the government to pass women's suffrage did not make enough of an impact. The WSPU's mission statement was, namely, to secure for women the parliamentary vote as it is or may be granted to men, and its methods in striving to attain this object were described as vigorous agitation upon lines justified by the position of outlawry to which women are at present condemned, the organizing of women all over the country to enable them to give adequate expression to their desire for political freedom, and was achieved by education of public opinion by all the usual methods, such as public meetings, demonstrations, debates, distribution of literature, newspaper correspondence, and deputations to public representatives. In deeds, however, the suffragettes held violent public protests, which clearly contradicted what was expected of them as women, often finding themselves behind bars. In this image, we see a suffragette being dragged away by the police during a protest, an image that seemed to define the stereotypical WSPU. For many, this type of radical and violent movement was deterrent to the cause of the women's suffrage movement, and caused many of the stereotypical images we associate with it. The Wild Rose of England is simply a metaphor for the way that these women were viewed as out of control and needing help from the male public. There was another option for proponents of women's suffrage, however. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, better known as the NUWSS, was a nonviolent and constitutional approach gaining women's suffrage. Founded by Millicent Garrett Fawcett, the NUWSS was formed from the combination of a number of prominent women's suffrage groups from around England in 1896. Fawcett was a highly educated woman who came from a family with values focusing on women's education and enlightenment. It is in part because of this support from her family that she was able to achieve what she did. The actions taken by the NUWSS were performed by women who called themselves suffragists. This advertisement, put out by the NUWSS, symbolizes the freedom that the organization fought for, the idea of a woman being able to go out into the world and proclaim her freedom through the vote. Unlike the suffragettes, the suffragists attained their goals through peaceful protests, education of the public, and meetings regarding the rights of women. One of the most interesting approaches that the NUWSS took to pursuing their goals was that they petitioned to the government for women's voting rights in a non-party fashion, essentially stressing the fact that they were catering to no party within Parliament, making voting rights a human rights issue as opposed to a polarized political one. Nevertheless, the NUWSS was frequently criticized for progressing far too slowly, to which Fawcett would reply that her organization was like a glacier, slow by its nature, yet mighty and irresistible in the long run. Though their tactics were much less radical and more peaceful than those of the WSPU, their tactics included collecting signatures for petitions demanding voting rights for women, lobbying the members of Parliament to get them to support their cause, and staging peaceful protests that demand rights for women. The NUWSS's actions were a reflection on their philosophy, which included educating the public and furthermore women on why it is important for women to have a say in the government, as well as why it is a woman's right to have a say in the government through suffrage. Furthermore, the NUWSS would outline their cause and educate people on why their cause was important through reasonable and not radical violent efforts. This was truly what made the NUWSS stand apart from the WSPU. Their actions were much less radical and therefore more well respected. Though they sought the same things in seemingly opposite ways, they both achieved different things as well. The NUWSS achieved a high degree of academic success and respect from the world, while the WSPU achieved a large amount of infamy and publicity, which attracted more people to the cause. Despite the fact that there were two factions of the women's suffrage movement, women who had very different mindsets about how to handle situations, they had one common enemy: the anti-suffragists. Anti-suffragists' arguments were simple. Women could not vote because they did not have the same capacity as men. In cartoons, such as this one, anti-suffragists would try to emphasize the stereotypical frivolity of women by suggesting that women will not want to vote if they are not put in a more social situation, such as a party where they can vote. Another angle that anti-suffragists argued is that women were already represented, by nature of the fact that by having their husbands, brothers, and fathers vote, the women's voices were also already heard. Though this particular poster was produced in the United States, its statement that women trust men to represent them on the battlefield, can they not trust men to represent them on election day, rings true to the fight that British suffragists fought. Why were so many men so afraid of having women be allowed to vote? Part of this has to do with the degeneration of manhood, which society was suffering from at the end of the century and into the early 20th century. The patriarchy was in the process of weakening, which was exacerbated by women gaining more and more rights, both inside and outside of the home. The women's suffrage movement was, therefore, yet another blow to the patriarchy, and furthermore, another example of the degeneration of man's role in society. Men were, quite simply, afraid of the impact women's suffrage would have on the already failing patriarchy and their monopoly on influence in the government. The government, and the election of government officials, was one of the last strongholds that men felt that they had. Though it would be a very long time before women truly had equal rights to men, women's suffrage was one of the first big symbolic victories in the realm of women's rights. The women's suffrage movement was one of the most significant movements of all times in women's rights. Both the NUWSS and the WSPU played vital roles in the passage and enactment of the Representation of the People Act 1918, an internationally revolutionary act, which would lead the way for other countries to pass similar acts. Though this was an incredibly small step in the liberation of women, symbolically allowing women the right to vote was a huge step in the right direction.